became very popular was
Hello and welcome to the two-man power trip of wrestling. I'm your host, JP John Paz. With me today, very special returning guest. He's an author. He's a podcast host. He's basically the guy who revolutionized the shoot interview. He is Mr. Sean Oliver. Sean, welcome back to the two-man power trip. How you doing?
it was first a compliment to be credited with starting what the podcast for wrestling has become.
Yes.
But when you watch enough of them and you do enough of them, it's not a responsibility I want any longer.
It's almost like anybody could do it, so anybody does it, and it's like, oh, some of it's not good. Yeah.
I always used to say when kayfabe commentaries came along and we started doing like shoot interviews with production, go figure.
Yes. Yes.
And then others came on board, and I think there was like a groundswell when it became very popular. What started to happen was people went, "Oh, so if I buy a good camera and lights and maybe a microphone, we can do that too." And I always used to say, like, you can buy the guitar, but you're not going to play like Eddie.
Yeah.
There's something else to it.
Yeah.
So, but here, fortunately, you don't have to fly anybody out anymore. You don't have to put anyone in a hotel room. You don't have to feed anybody anymore. You barely have to pay them.
Yep.
So why the hell not? You're sitting in your basement anyway, for God's sakes.
Right. You don't have to feed them alcohol either, or whatever. Yeah. Perfect.
Write a list of questions and just get them on Zoom.
It is crazy though, because obviously, like with you, like you had the personality and other stuff. Some other guys that did those shoots was just like, they're reading off a piece of paper, A, question B, you know what I mean? They're just going down a list. I mean, yours are actually good, informative, entertaining. The guests obviously like you. Nash, obviously you do a show with him. He loved doing the interviews with you. So, I mean, yours was definitely a step above some of the other guys.
Yeah, of course. And it really just boiled down to doing everything better than everybody else.
Yeah.
Writing a better show, shooting it better, lighting it better, having a rapport. This is very hard, the computer. When I first did my solo podcast in 2019, I did it just to get my feet wet and learn the industry a little bit.
Right.
How it all works from a production standpoint, reporting standpoint, advertising, all that stuff. And I realized very quickly that I was handicapped by not sitting in the room with the person. There's so much to be said for kind of an exchange of energy, and not to get too Rob Van Dam on everybody here, but there's an energy that goes on between you and a guest, and you need to have that. And I found that it put them at ease. There's an engagement, a physical engagement when you're a foot away from somebody. That was lost here. So that I said I'm just one of the pack now. I'm just reading questions. Maybe the questions are good, or maybe there are follow-ups, but that superpower thing, that when you connect with somebody, that's going to be gone here, and it has been ever since. Even sitting and talking to Nash on video is very different than when we talk in person, and it's a handicap. It's the bastard child of the interview medium, and unfortunately, it's become the standard for wrestling. I mean, you still have to go and be on the Tonight Show, but we all do this way now, and the product is worse for it.
Really? You think so?
I do, sure, of course. People still get on and tell stories, but listen, anyone that credits kayfabe commentaries or me for what our product was back in the day, that is the difference. Yes, it was lit, it was mic'd, it was shot, we had a crew, it was a real production. The shows were written 70, 80 pages before we went in. But the stuff that happened on the set. Do you think Roddy Piper would have opened up about Pat Patterson to somebody on a video like this versus me sitting right next to him,
True. Definitely
being
not. Yep.
able to pat his hand and say, "It's okay, Roddy. You don't have to go there if you don't want."
Right.
And him pushing through and saying, "No, I got to be a man. I got to tell the story." That only happens in person, so that's over.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. For sure. Yeah. You're not getting that sort of thing over the internet for sure. But you get some good stuff from Nash. I know, obviously, you guys do have a real life rapport, but you do get some good stuff from Nash on there.
Yeah, he's a born storyteller anyway. I mean, anyone who's met him knows you just have to kind of drop a seedling into the soil, and there's abundant growth shortly thereafter about almost anything. I haven't found anything I can't talk to him about yet, which makes him a good co-host. But yeah, he's just a natural raconteur, as they say.
For sure. But as far as like what you've got going on, of course, I wanted to kind of talk about this before we really got going here was Todd Gordon's book, Todd is God. Tell us about the official, it's not the unofficial,
Yes.
it's the official story about the creation of ECW.
Well, damn it, only one person can tell the story about the creation of ECW, and it's him. I began. Todd was on a couple of the kayfabe commentary shows.
Yeah, oh, yeah.
And got great content. I was an ECW fan, so I loved talking to him about that. But what off the air, as we would talk, and he would tell me things that I had, like everybody else, come to accept a different version of reality, either due to just years of storytelling or reading things in the sheets or hearing things in the wrestling media, that it upended much of what I knew to be true. So I would tell him, Todd, you have to write a book about this, just as a fan standpoint. And I said, let's write it together. I hadn't even published a book yet, and I wanted to get into that. Was the one form of media I hadn't done yet. I was in movies and TV shows all through my 20s and 30s, and I had the interview stuff here but I hadn't done anything in publishing. So I said, let's do it. This would be a great book. I'll write it with you. And we were set to do it. I mean, we were like that week I was going down to Philly and I was going to begin to record stuff. Zoom had not become a part of our life yet. This is 2017. So I was going to go down and sit with the recorder, and he didn't. He ended up not wanting to do it. His sister had gotten ill, and he was tied up with things and not ready to bare his soul and tell the whole story, which I was fine with, because I'd rather that honesty than somebody who sits down and gives me a worked book. Not that I would have accepted it, but to give me the headache of having to sift through that stuff. So that's when I wrote Kayfabe, my first book, because I was all geared up and jazzed up and ready to write. So I wrote that, and 6 books later, 3 nonfiction and 3 novels, he said, I'm ready. I said, great. So over the course of maybe 8 or 9 months, we would get together 2 to 3 times a week, and I'd record our Zoom calls, 2 or 3 hours a session, 4 if we were really getting crazy. And after about 60 hours, I knew we had a book. I shouldn't say after 60 hours. We got to 60 hours, but about halfway through that, I began to assemble it. I was transcribing what we were recording, and then I began to assemble it into a timeline and do the research, go back and get a date. Because you're talking to someone casually. He goes, I don't know, sometime that first year, Sandman and Raven were in the ring. So okay, so I got to find it. Fortunately, the internet is full of resources for that stuff. So I was able to plug in the dates, the locations, the attendances sometimes, and what we got was a great book about a little bit of Todd's life beforehand, which illustrates why he was not qualified whatsoever to run a wrestling company. A jeweler on Conservative Jewelers Row in Philadelphia,
Right.
inheriting the family business. And at night, people are getting chairs wrapped around their heads. So that was an interesting dichotomy. I had to go into his life because I thought that was interesting to show that difference. Um, and then the book works in on so many levels. I'm a fan of the book I wrote. It's weird to say, but it's got intense rereadability because there's a ton of crazy ECW stories. So if you're a fan of shoot interviews and you don't really care about the business, you just want to hear stories about Sandman hiding 8 balls of cocaine throughout the travel lodge, you can do that. But it is also a book about the wrestling business and the blow by blow of how he and Paul Heyman came together and then fell apart and then fell apart again for good. And that was the stuff to me that was most interesting. Like the mole story, right? I
Yep.
had always heard it posited that Todd Gordon was a company mole looking to get people out of ECW. I didn't do a lot of detective work back then. I was in college, but now talking to him, he's like, Sean, I got Public Enemy a job while I was in ECW with Paul. Everyone knew it. Everyone was fine with it. Raven had already gone. Who else was it? Saturn had already gone on their own. Why was this different? And why it was different was the locker room was becoming fractured. That Philly, New York crew thing was really starting to form a chasm. And Paul E., who'd always been able to kind of rally the troops, was losing his grip on the locker room. Todd had already pulled out his money. Nobody knew that. They kayfabed the boys because they wanted stability. They wanted everybody to think everything was the same. Todd was just appearing there as a figurehead from 95 on and to recoup the money that Paul agreed to pay him back that he lost when he gave the company to Paul. So he had to keep coming back to recoup that investment. So when Fonzie didn't want to be there anymore because of all the bullshit, and Sandman was tired of all the fucking locker room fighting, and they went to Todd and were like, can you call like you did for Johnny? And so Paul and Todd talked about it. And Paul, to his genius credit, his diabolical genius, he said, listen, don't tell the locker room that you're doing this. Let me use this, and then you will come back and be the greatest heel in professional wrestling. So Todd agreed, and for years never told the mole story, that he would allow Paul to use that to galvanize the locker room, because the it's us against the world was gone. So now there was an us against the mole. Don't let those WCW bastards take us down, and whoever's working with them. So, and
Yep.
Todd was shocked. He watched the DVD. He was shocked that Paul had never smartened anybody up. He was just on Francine's show recently, and her mind was blown because he's like, none of the boys got smartened up by this. He's like, I couldn't believe it when I was watching the DVD, and he was still perpetuating this mole shit. And so I hear this, right, and I'm like,
Yep.
Todd, you gotta write the book. So that's just one of a lot of tales of, I'm going to use the word betrayal, and it certainly was Todd's perception of how the company was wrested from his hands.
That's such a good story. And to me, it's almost opposite. And I know I mentioned this to Todd a while ago, but it's almost like Paul was the mole for Vince in the WWF, and he turned Todd into the mole for WCW. But it was like, wait a second, you're doing that for Vince.
So later on, everybody finds out. I think it was actually JR that kind of blew the whistle on this on his podcast
Right.
several years ago. He talked about $50,000 payments, monthly payments to Paul from Vince. Now, those didn't start till after. Admittedly, when the mole stuff was going on, he was not yet taking money from Vince, best I can ascertain. But in the research for this, I have the bankruptcy filing from ECW. Well, it's not ECW, it was HHG, the name that Paul used after
Heyman, Gordon. Yeah.
Gordon. Yeah.
Right.
But in their bankruptcy filings, you have to list all of your creditors to whom you owe money. $500,000 to World Wrestling Entertainment. Can you think of one business deal they had where
Maybe a couple.
WWE paid 500 a $500,000? It was probably paid over time, over many,
Yes.
many years, and it doesn't say what it was for. There's a category what it was for, nothing specific, but yeah, I mean, I have that paperwork, and so yes, you're absolutely correct. If you want to talk about moles,
Obviously, Paul was one for Vince and feeding him talent and getting maybe money for his pay-per-views to get off the ground. And funny,
but a brilliant stroke on Vince's part to keep this. I mean, there was still some fat left on that bone. So if they had just fizzled and disappeared, if the Federation broke down and Vince inherited these kind of second-hand talent from ECW, his perception secondhand. Of course, I think much of the ECW roster was very talented, but to his perception in his wrestling bubble, it was just the secondary Philadelphia Federation. But to keep it alive, keep it going, let it get some pay-per-views under its belt, and then slice its throat and get the blood.
for sure. But it's interesting. I mean, obviously, Paul and Vince still working together to this day. So
no doubt part of that deal, right? Wouldn't you say, if you had to speculate, as part of that deal and keeping the business going, and it's a, well, young man, you'll have a job here for life. How many people can say they've had a tenure with WWE as long as he? And you, I mean, talent today, he's an on-camera and off-camera talent. He's not an in-ring talent.
right.
You know, he's a manager. What managers have had that tenure in WWE?
Yes, pretty. I can't even think of one really. I mean,
Right.
think of Bobby the Brain. It was his run was like 9 years there. You know what I mean? It
Right.
was like guys
Yeah.
like that. Pretty crazy. And I know off like camera, obviously Harvey Whippleman that was working there, but really more behind the scenes.
He was
wasn't
primarily
also
in office, right? Exactly.
yeah. And like Brooklyn Brawler, but he was like behind the scenes guy too for everybody. Yeah, the Heyman stuff is amazing, but I think it's one of those things where Heyman almost wanted to erase Todd Gordon from history because he's ECW. Wait, but and I was like, wait a second, Todd invented it. He's like, no, I created it. You know what I mean? He wants to erase Todd from history.
It was, and it's largely happened, or it did until
Right.
the release of Todd is God.
Yep.
Where people, if they want to, can read, or the audiobook is out. You're treated to many of my impressions of the ECW roster. But yeah, and that's, and again, going back to why I was emphasizing that Todd had to tell this story, that was another thing. I was saying, are you not bothered that your legacy has been reduced to, I mean, people know you started it, but I think people believe you had a bar federation in 92, and then Heyman showed up in 93 and bought the company, took over, and put you on as some kind of Jack Tunney figurehead commissioner.
Yep.
You know, they don't know that you ran this company up until you gave it, until you withdrew your money. And another reason I said that you've got to solidify some of your legacy here with ECW. There's no denying, and it's throughout the book that Todd said the genius of Paul Heyman was responsible for so much of what they did together, but it was definitely a two-person dance that was going on, even creatively. I mean, their friendship was built on them talking on the phone constantly all week long, coming up with these bizarre angles, coming up with, the next Dudley, one more ridiculous than the last, cracking each other up. It was a Simon and Garfunkel. It was that rare, two-person symbiotic genius that was happening until the business began to swallow them, and Paul proved maybe not to be the business partner and best friend that Todd thought he had.
it's crazy to think that like the guy who actually created it, the guy who's responsible, is almost like wiped from history because the guy who came in after him, and not even after him, was like after the guy that came in after him is based, you know what I mean? Like Eddie Gilbert's there, and I mean there's other guys before Paul, but it's like one of those things where it's like, wow, I can't believe Paul. It's like a little bit of a shyster there, completely trying to erase his former friend from the history of the company because it makes his legacy seem like, no, I created it or I'm the god of ECW.
Well, Paul is tailor made for the world of professional wrestling, on camera and off, and is crafty and brilliant at what he does. The line that closes one of the chapters when Todd realizes he doesn't have ECW anymore. He said, I lost my baby in a game I didn't even know I was playing. And that's kind of how it ended up. Now, Todd's drive in staying on board, I would have said F you, walked out and let the thing fizzle.
Yep.
Todd was always thinking about Francine and Sandman and all these people, Sabu, who put himself in harm's way for $200 a night for years. And Todd knew if he sank ECW by walking away and pulling everything out, Vince isn't hiring these people. They're never going to work. And he did it to keep everybody working. And even when Sabu was contacted to go to WCW, and Terry Taylor, I guess it was, who was talking to Todd about it, and Sabu said to Todd, yeah, I can't go because of my contract. Todd goes, what contract? You never signed a contract with me. He said, Paul said I have a contract, and he'll sue me, so I can't go. And so Todd went to Paul and said, this guy has literally broken his neck for us. And you see this as a betrayal that he's leaving? And that was the biggest difference between Todd and Paul. When someone got a deal somewhere, Todd was thrilled. He was like, this is how it's supposed to happen. You work for $100, $200. Now you go get your contract. You get called up to the majors.
Yes.
Paul was furious, and he saw it as a betrayal. I gave you this shot, and you're leaving me? And Sabu, not the best negotiator, perhaps, was afraid. I mean, in the book, I say that Todd said that Paul probably waved a piece of toilet paper with some pencil scribbled on it and said, "Here, you signed this contract. Don't you remember that? I'll sue you."
Right.
And what happened was he ended up scaring WCW, and he told Terry Taylor that he has a contract and we will sue you if he shows up on television. So even when Sabu or Todd called in on his behalf, I forget which one, they said, we're not going to touch it. It's messy with this contract thing. So that was more of the friction between them. Todd wanted to graduate people out of the Federation.
And obviously Paul did not, and he kept Sabu around. But man, that stinks for Sabu because I'm sure he would have got what, $200,000 a year, or I mean whatever WWE was going to give him at that point. And then he goes back to ECW, and who knows what he's getting paid.
When Sandman signed with WCW, of course they didn't use him right, and it was whatever.
Yeah.
But he made some money at least.
Right.
He called Paul. He called Todd, excuse me, in the car in Atlanta, leaving CNN Tower. And he said, "Yo, they offered me, 300, and so Todd's like, oh my, thank God you took." He's like, "No, man." He's like, "I would have lost that fucking match." He said, "What match?" He said, "Paulie said I have an exploding cage match against Onita that he's putting together in Japan. I'm going to get so much press." He's like, "First of all, there's a 99% chance that match is not even real." Secondly, you're going to turn down a $300,000 a year annual salary for one match? Are you insane? He said, "I'll never talk to you again if you don't turn that car around." And he did. He turned around, he went back, and he asked to have the contract back, and he signed it.
That is insane, Paul. I mean, just making stuff up on the fly. Holy, and he obviously knew what Sandman would like, and he's feeding into that. But man, what a liar! That's crazy.
Well, these are the stories that I was treated to by the people that are in the book. And listen, I hosted however many hundreds or thousands of hours of it. Everyone had a Paul Heyman story.
Yeah.
Everybody had a story about being screwed out of money. But the funny thing was, and I've said this on air many times, everyone talked about being robbed by Paul Heyman with a smile. He was a jester thief, a jester slash thief hybrid.
Yeah.
And everybody kind of laughed about, the second check bounced. But this was one time where Todd lost an investment of savings and a family fortune or family savings, I should say, in the company. So it was no longer funny. And I think that when people read it, they'll see the degree to which some damage was done. The one thing that I kept going back to when I wrote this, if Todd and Paul could have gotten their shit straightened out, and the company had an investment, they had a few opportunities for investment to save them and pull them out of the water, and had that happened, I wonder how far ECW would have gone. Because you have the TV product, right? That's one thing. And then you've got the business. The TV product was already like, how are you going to top this? The funny story in the book, Mick Foley turns to Paul and Todd one night when they're booking the match, and he goes, I guess the only thing left is the Daffy Duck spot. And they knew exactly what he meant. There was an old Looney Tunes where Daffy and Bugs are trying to outdo each other as magicians, and for the last spot, he blows himself up, and as his spirit is going up to heaven, Daffy says, "I can only do it once." So that was what Mick was referencing.
Yeah.
And yeah, it got to that point, the Daffy Duck spot. Like someone's gonna have to kill themselves in the ring, and then where do you go from there? So, so the product was getting to a point where it was gonna bust. It was a bubble that was impossible to take any more air. And then you've got the business where ECW was not filling an arena. They were filling small venues, 800 maybe in ECW Arena, Viking Hall, maybe 1,000 if the fire marshal wasn't looking. But that was it. A decent amount of money from tapes, from videotapes, but that was the revenue. Couple of live shows a weekend and videotapes. They're paying MSG Network $3,000 a week to air a show for which they have no advertising. They're paying Sunshine Network in Florida $3,000 a week. That's $6,000 a week combined, $24,000 a month for all of you mathematicians out there.
Yes.
For a product that puts 800 people in an arena, and they sell some videotapes on the internet. They were so much more popular than rich and famous. They were the famous. They weren't the rich. They couldn't generate the money from that niche that they would have needed to sustain a national product. So could it ever have worked is what I return to as I go through the story. Had they gotten that deal with HBO, had they gotten this, had they gotten that, had they gotten a full slate of advertisers on MSG Network, what would it even have done?
It is crazy to think that. And then too, it's like they get the video game, but it's not like the good video game. You know what I mean? They get the action figures, but it's like the third string action figures. You know what I mean? Even the deals they did get were all like, oh man, like the bottom of the barrel, like crappy deals. It's like that WWF or WCW would have scoffed at, or like they wouldn't have wanted. So even when they got something good, it wasn't good.
Yeah, it's like the two-party system in the United States, right? You could have a third-party identity that comes along that a lot of people go, yeah, that's right, F those other two. But the poll numbers are it's always going to be, 5% of the vote.
Yep.
And they were the Green Party. They were the Tea Party. They were that third party ECW in a land made for, giants.
They were the Ross Perot. Yeah.
Yeah.
And if you look at it too, I think WWF and WCW, I think we get 60% of pay-per-views. And I was reading, it was like ECW, it was 50-50 split. something like that. It wasn't a 60-40, it was like 50-50. So even when they did better than WCW on some pay-per-views towards the end, they probably ended up making less because they were only doing a 50-50 split, and God knows when you get paid from those pay-per-view companies.
That right there is the caveat with pay-per-view, and it's why none of the minor companies are going to be competitive. It may have changed now. Let me just say that. But using the model that was in existence in 1997, the way it worked was you paid your providers, People's Choice or whoever the major
In Demand or whatever, yeah.
Right. And it was about $250,000 to reserve that spot on the calendar. Because remember, pay-per-view covered boxing, international stuff like soccer. So you needed to reserve that, and you needed to do it well in advance. So what happens? You book your first pay-per-view. What an accomplishment. We've made it, right? Well, guess what? Before it takes the 4 to 6 months to get paid, you've got to book your next one at $250,000. You just spent $250,000 to put this to get this one on pay-per-view. Forget about the production costs and all your regular monthly costs. Now you've got to book that second one, and you're behind. You have to wait months for the payment. And that's the difficulty of a company that size. You could never front all those payments until the back end payments start rolling in. It was an untenable situation, and that was really the problem with ECW and pay-per-view. And it's also why Todd, I mean, they talked about pay-per-view for years, but it's why he never wanted to go forward with it, and it happened once he was out. He was there again, but in a figurehead role.
Yep.
But when he was no longer holding the purse strings, whatever happens. But as long as he was in charge of it, he wasn't going to make that investment because it's a cyclical thing. And if you don't make back the first and you're committed to 3, you're dead.
It's crazy, and to think like, oh, we did so well in that pay-per-view. Well, we won't see that money for 4 months. You know what I mean? Right. It's like, oh, shit.
Yeah, and they want another $250,000 check for the pay-per-view 3 months from now.
Yep, and then you'll be out of business. What is it? How many ever months later? It's just crazy, like just how that happened. But if you think about it, it's like, wow, they were so, I don't know, not mainstream. I wouldn't say mainstream, but they were a part of the culture for a while. Everybody kind of knew like who ECW was and like what they were about. But it's like they couldn't get the business going. Like Paul was such a genius in one aspect, but for some reason the business aspect didn't really jive with him.
They came around. Remember I guess we're close to the same age. Mm-hmm. Remember the state of the business in 92, 93 in the majors, okay? And it's, I mean, wrestling, hockey players and pig farmers and garbage men, and that's what it had become. Now, if you're my age and you watched through the 80s, that Hillbilly Jim was fine when you're 12. Hulkamania, baby. But now you're 19 and you're in college, and Soundgarden and Nirvana are on the radio, and grunge is big. Tarantino's movies are on, and the bad guys are talking like good guys now. I'm starting to like them more. And my childhood product has not evolved. There's pig farmers on television still. Henry Godwin is on TV still. So here comes ECW, right? You still have that. You're still bitten by that wrestling bug, but now there's guys that dress like you. They talk cool. The booking is for you, for smart fans. Not insulting your intelligence. They know you read the sheets, so they're going to do things for you to make you chuckle, because they knew you read about this in Meltzer's deal that week.
Yep.
So it spoke to me, and it spoke to people my age. So it came along at the right time. That's where it had its advantage over WCW and WWE. That was the rocket fuel. And there were ECW chants in WWE arenas anytime, something violent happened or something cool happened. Um, but then when Vince and Eric started to change their product, NWO guys were acting like ECW guys now. The WWE product borrowed that very sexual attitude from a lot of what Paul and Todd were doing with the valets there. Hey, I think there was a guy in WWE that even started drinking beers in the ring, like
Right.
Sandman. I can't remember his name, but I think there was one.
Sure.
So once they caught up, there was no way to usurp them because of the power of their television, their marketing, their fan base. But when that short period of 2 years or so where ECW was doing what they weren't, that was the rocket fuel that did get them mainstream wrestling coverage. But once WWE and WCW put their machine, manufacturing the beverage that everyone was drinking, watching ECW, it could never have the reach.
And I remember a buddy of yours, I believe, maybe even said it to you. He said, "Hey, when you were watching Heat, were you rooting for Pacino or you rooting for De Niro?" And most of the people were saying, actually, De Niro, even though he's the villain, the heel, he's the bad guy, but everybody's rooting for De Niro in the movie. And actually, you know what I mean? They're rooting for the bad guy.
Yeah, it was a culture change in that kind of pop art, the pop culture, and Paul Heyman was visionary in that, and Todd gives him full credit in the book. Todd actually speculates, had Eddie not quit, or had he hired Sullivan, who he was considering, and not Paul, what would have been different? Well, a lot of things would have been great, but the one thing that Eddie and Kevin never would have had that Paul had was that ear to the ground on pop culture, hip hop, grunge, what the guys should look like, the music they should put in there, opening the show with White Zombie. Eddie was never going to be starting. You know what I mean? Like there was a difference in that mentality, and Paul was visionary in that way. Even the word extreme that Paul comes up with, they decide that Shane's going to do the screw job, and they don't need anybody else. They don't want to be the NWA. Screw everybody. They're going to do their own thing, be their own federation. Paul says, we need a name like Extreme. We can't be Eastern anymore because we're going to get national coverage from this. He says, what about Extreme? Todd's like, yeah, you think? He's like, this word is going to be everywhere. He goes, there's extreme sports starting now. So he knew.
Guys, you're going to brush your teeth today? Why is that? Because it's a healthy part of your day and you don't want bad teeth. I want you to take it another step and add skincare habits to your daily routine. I just did, and I promise you I'm never going back. I am hooked on Caldera Lab high performance men's skincare products. Told you guys last time around that first impressions matter. Your teeth and your skin are the first thing someone notices about you. Backed by legit clinical trials that found 94% of men's skin showed an overall younger looking appearance after using the products for only a few weeks. Caldera Lab is the regimen you've been looking for. Habit stacking, habit hacking, whatever you call it, Caldera Lab is here to take your daily routine to skin royalty. Take my word for it, or one of the thousands of 5-star reviews. And just for our audience, we have an exclusive offer. This is the best offer available anywhere. Use the promo code POWERTRIP at calderalab.com and 20% off right now. That's right, 20% off using the promo code POWERTRIP at Caldera Lab and make an unforgettable first impression that leads to the charming words, "You look younger." 20% off at Caldera Labs with the promo code POWERTRIP. Get to calderalab.com www.wrestling.com today.
That extreme sports, that
Yeah.
was all going to
Yep.
become something. So that's more of the being ahead of the curve past WWE, past WCW, and how Todd and Paul were thinking at the time.
Even with him, like in current day, it seems like I know he's had some guys that didn't quite work out, like maybe Ryback or Joe Hennig or something like that. But I think the guys he manages, okay, he sees Lesnar, all time great, Punk for a while, that was an awesome run. Reigns, it's like
Reigns.
even the guys he manages, he like kind of sees the future. Like, okay, I want to attach myself to like these guys that are going to be the biggest stars in the company for a long time.
Well, I don't know who's responsible for what or what percentage he chooses versus they choose, but something that
Right.
Todd talked about in the book was he and Paul both had a fondness for the character beyond the wrestling ability. They loved characters. So they would always try to extract, unless it's like a comedy character like Meanie or one of the Dudleys or something. But the wrestlers, they were always looking for them to be more themselves than anything else. So they were looking for that thread in them that was unique, that would come across as honest, because the stuff that was on TV again was so charactery that, you know, there's Mike Rotunda, one of the great amateur wrestlers, and he's playing a tax auditor at IRS. So it was like, really? So what they tried to do is find some authenticity before they put someone on TV as whatever they were going to become, and they would rework them. There's great stories in the book about guys who weren't able to get over because they came with what they were doing before. Tommy Dreamer came down from New York. He had this bouffant hairdo, this glittery suspenders, and it was like, and the people couldn't stand him.
Yep.
But when he took those cane shots and was able to withstand that abuse in the ring, he instantly got over with the fans. It was like, okay, this is just a guy being beaten and summoning up this courage. There's no character behind this. Taz came down as the Tasmaniac. He's running around as this like hybrid jungle creature slash bouncer in Brooklyn, but then when they let him talk, and when they let him be Taz, he got over. So it was sometimes stripping away some of what people brought down to ECW and letting them be themselves. Sandman with the surfboard for
Horrible.
the first few
Yeah.
years there. And then Todd went to Paul. He said, listen, just let him be a roofer that beats people up. Like, just let him walk to the ring. He smokes and drinks. Let him smoke and drink in the ring. And Paul was like, you can't smoke in a ring. And Todd, who learned from Eddie, who had tops whipped off and tits out in the ring, that you can do anything as long as it's in a wrestling ring. For some reason, wrestling gets a pass. He said, no, Paul, you can do anything in a ring. Let's have him smoke in the ring. And Sandman just became Jim Fullington in the ring.
It's pretty crazy if you just look at like just Todd and his guys versus Paul and his guys. Like, did Paul like Sandman? I mean, because that's a Todd guy. Scorpio's a Todd. You know what I mean? How did that?
It's very
work?
funny. There was a Todd's guys, Paul's guys kind of thing, and there was the New York, right? But then there were guys that just gravitated towards one or the other. Like Sabu was always seen as a Todd guy.
Yeah.
Wasn't a Philly guy, but he became a Todd guy. Johnny Grunge, Public Enemy, they were Todd's boys. So it did start as a Philly, New York thing, and then it just kind of became how people gravitated towards one another. A funny thing, a funny story in the book that I didn't know. The fans started this New York Philly thing because they were smart. They would read the sheets. They knew who were Paul's guys. And when some of the guys would come to the ring in Philly, they would chant "New York sucks," not Taz sucks. New York sucks. And in New York, they would chant Philly sucks. So Todd goes, the fans handed us an amazing angle. He's, you take the New York guys, and I'll be with the Philly guys. Paul's like, I'm not gonna be a heel. Todd said, Paul, you've been a heel on television for 10 years. What are you talking about? He's like, not now, not with ECW. No one's going to boo me. He's like, but we're both heels and we're both faces. You're only booed down here, and I'm going to be booed when we go up there. It's like, I'm not going to be. So they had to let the angle go, but they were listening to the chant where
Yep.
Todd was, and he was like, Paul, they're giving us something here. And that happens so often. Fans created so much. I closed one of the chapters by saying, like, we had 500 bookers in the house every night. And they would kind of show where they wanted stuff to go. And, the smartest bookers listen.
Yep. That's what you got to do. It's almost like you can't just force stuff down their throat. I mean, that's why WWE was like terrible for years. Remember, they just try to force feed stuff down your throat forever. And then all of a sudden it's okay, let's start listening to fans. And then, had they not, they probably would have been like, Steve Austin, don't forget about this guy. Don't push this guy.
Yeah.
He's blasphemous or whatever. Austin 316, don't push this guy. But you got to listen to the fans.
And workers too. There are workers that was one of the things that Paul and Todd did so well was guys that proved worthy, like Raven and Sandman and Taz. They would put their shit together, and Paul and Todd would be like, "You guys got it?" Like, yeah. He's like, "All right, got 11 minutes," and they trusted. And when the boys came to them with stuff, they listened. They didn't always go with everything, but they listened. And another great story in the book, when they said to Foley, "We want to turn you heel," and he was like, "In Philly, in ECW?" He goes, "That's never going to happen." They were like, "We want to do it. Think of a way." They charged him with it, and he said, "All right, let me think about it." And about a week later, he came to them. He goes, "I think I got it," and he proposed not doing anything hardcore. How do you turn Philly against you? You pick up the chair and then you go, "No, I'm going to do an armbar." And listen, had he gone on the mic and insulted the fans, they would have loved it. Had he shit on the baby faces, they would have loved it. But if you don't use the chair and you don't take out the table and you're not doing the elbow drop from the apron anymore, they want to kill you. That was Mick.
And it's funny. Remember, he said he was like Eric Bischoff's best friend, and sometimes he had a WCW shirt on.
That's right.
I talked to Uncle Eric. Yeah. It's like I talked to Uncle Eric before, and he doesn't want me working here anymore. And then they boo. Then they hated him. Yeah.
John, what a blessing it must be to have talent like so smart on your roster that like you don't ever have to worry. Whatever they go out there and do, it's going to be over. Like on his last night, like everyone that reads the sheets knew it was going to be his last night. So he takes the mic and he's like, "I do have to thank two people before I leave. One's a visionary for starting this, the other a creative genius for guiding us." And Paul and Todd are up in the Eagle's Nest, and they look at each other. They get up. They're going to walk down. And Cactus goes, "So I give you Stevie Richards and the Blue Meanie." And they hit New York, New York in the house, and they come out. And Todd and Paul look at each other like, this fucking guy's so good. They didn't know.
Yeah. Wow, that's awesome. They had no idea. That's great.
Yeah, but the more
pretty
credit to his genius.
Pretty ballsy of like Todd and Paul though. Like they wrote.
I lost you for 1 second. Say that again.
I mean, they would give the guy so much rope and like give them great. Yep, you got me? Still there?
Yeah, you're just going in and out a little bit. Can you hear me okay?
Oh. I was saying it's pretty amazing. Hey, you sink or swim. Here you go. What you got to do.
Couldn't do it with everybody, right? But someone like Mick, you could certainly trust.
Still there?
Hello? I think we're having some...
Yep, can you hear me?
You're breaking up. Let me type this in the chat.
Can you hear me?
I can hear you now.
You
there? You there?
Yep, I'm here.
Okay. How about now? You still
Good.
good?
I don't know what the heck's going on. See, that's why you got to be in person, right? That's why you need the
Exactly. This is
interconnectivity
another.
of being in
You
person,
sound
not
better
not
now.
over the computer.
You sound better now. Am I okay? No, I guess not.
Yeah. Yep. You're good.
Oh, you go. Okay. Okay. I think we have a little delay too. I'm hearing some time between our questions and answers, but we can just you can edit this out, right? Obviously.
Oh yeah. Yeah. Yep. Oh, but I was saying like to have guys like that, you give them a creative freedom. It's amazing
Yeah, and
to be
it's
able
got
to
to be
just do that, and obviously you have to have the confidence to do it. But
the right guys. You know, that's what it was. And fortunately, you had so many of them in ECW where they could trust guys like Mick or Scotty.
when you're doing this book and you're working with Todd and you finish it, all told, like how long did it actually take you guys? It took you more than 60 hours or whatever. I mean, how long does it take you to put the book together?
Yeah, the recording was 60 hours, but then we had to go through and we had to cut, obviously, cut it down and polish things up. We treated it was very much like a writer's room for the Sid Caesar show. You know, we had to make sure things that were funny, punched, stories that were supposed to elicit a laugh were set up the right way. Todd and I are good that way, so we were able to have that back and forth and make sure that all the stories fleshed out the right way. So all told, I guess, oh God, what did it take us? Over a year probably, and then once the publisher gets involved, once we sold it, um, it becomes a matter of incorporating some of their stuff. But I write very cleanly from a first draft, even so. Editors at publishing houses should be erecting a statue to me because I make their jobs so easy, and you know that's true, Jacob, for this book. And even like the cover, like I did a mock-up cover for and sent it to them, and I said I want it to look like this. I said, and the font should be like this. And they were all fine with it each step of the way. And chapter headers, I said you should have a thread of barbed wire through each chapter header, and they were great. They incorporated everything and didn't resist me at all. So that process was very smooth, but it's lengthy. From the time the book company gets the book, a book that they consider ready to go, it's about a year and a half before it hits the street. So
Pretty lengthy time there. I mean,
yeah,
but it's awesome because what you're doing. I mean, you're telling his life, but I mean, you're getting the story out. You're ending each chapter correctly with awesome like lines and stuff. So I mean, it's a process.
yeah, it's all an art, and it's like any other art form. You're chiseling a sculpture. You know, you start whacking away with the big tools, and then eventually, it's coming down to the fine filing that you do at the end. I'm working with Sean Waltman, doing his book now, his story, and we're about 80% through the first draft, getting it all out on paper. About 80,000 words right now, and waiting to hear back from a few publishers right now. We have a few offers coming. So that process begins again. And the funny thing is, everybody's so different. Like my process with Todd, my process with Sean are different. And the most important part of my many jobs with the book, other than putting it together, making it readable, and worrying about the pacing and stuff, is the voice. I'm writing as somebody else, so that voice has to be consistent. Now, one of the compliments I get from people who know Todd is I felt like that it was entirely written by Todd, and so that's to hear that is good, and that's a tricky part of it, to make sure that the reader hears the person whose story this is in their mind when they read it.
It's pretty awesome that Waltman. I didn't even know that that was coming out. I mean, he's got
Oh
quite a
yeah.
story. I mean, God, he's been in the business forever too. I mean, and he's been everywhere.
I have to say that the book covers, I mean, WWE, WCW, Japan, Mexico, but beyond that, his life is amazing. I mean, if anyone's had 9 lives, it's him, and he'll tell you he shouldn't be here. And so many times over, just the tumultuous time when he was with Joni, with China, and a lot of that was caught on camera, in public and on VH1 and all that, and um, but then even stuff before that, really challenging, and his God, his purity. As of anyone who knows him, I would just was on a show and they did word association with me and they threw people's names out and they threw Waltman out, and I said pure, because here is somebody that I think is one of those rare cases that has learned from the errors of their ways and emerged such a sincere, um, intelligent, not just intelligent here, spiritually intelligent person, and accepts blame for anything he's done. Does not point the finger unless it's a deserved finger, but he accepts what he's done in his life, um, celebrates the victories, but also wears the failures too. And his story is tragic and difficult, and he belongs in more than just the Wrestling Hall of Fame. If there is ever a Hall of Fame for perseverance, survival, and success, he belongs in that one too.
Thing about him, and I always said it, and Kevin Sullivan agreed with me too. Had he not jumped ship from WCW, had WCW not fired them, I don't know if the Attitude Era, and people could say, I mean, he's still at Austin, all this other stuff, but that made, he was from the NWO, he's 6, he goes to DX, he basically makes Triple H, he makes the Outlaws, he gets them over, he cuts a promo making fun of Hogan, because remember Hogan said he couldn't cut the mustard, so then he makes fun of Hogan, and he says, Bischoff, get your head out of his ass. It just felt like he was the momentum changer. It's like, wait a second, you guys are supposed to be stealing guys from WWF. Like now you got a WCW guy from the NWO. That like to me, and kind of underrated and almost underestimated. He pushed people over to WWF big time.
I remember Sullivan telling me that. It's funny you mentioned Sullivan. I remember him telling me that years ago. He's like, go back and look. The one that made the difference was X-Pac. He was washing his gear in the sink, standing in his underwear, talking to me about that. And I'm standing there like, all right, it's an uncomfortable moment, Kevin. We're going to talk about X-Pac now? Really? I just wanted to come in and give you some money. But I guess that's why it stuck with me. But yes, you're absolutely right. Look at the lineage, right? He'll be the first one to tell you, 1, 2, 3 kid. He was not thrilled about so much of what that time was, but has the opportunity to be in the NWO, and on the heels of that, DX,
Yep.
across the street at the competitor, going from the biggest faction and television time wise too, crossing the street and being part of DX, and then just riding that wave. He was great. He's one of those guys that, talent sometimes becomes impossible to ignore, right? He's always the first one to tell you he was never proud of a lot of his work on the stick, which is so much of professional wrestling, as you know. But here's a guy who was so committed to the sport, and again, the pure love of wrestling. And he was a student of the business, even while he was in it. I mean, it wasn't that cool to be on the road, um, you know, knowing what everybody's deal was and every other company, checking the sheets, knowing what was going on. But that knowledge, he always said, was power for him, to know what other people's deals were, where other people were going, what other federations were looking for. And he was so smart that way that he became a student of the business, while most of the other guys were just living up the 24/7 party. He did share partying too, but the business was always important to him, in addition to the in-ring product.
I always say if he doesn't jump and you keep Hall and Nash together with him, I mean the real Wolfpack, keep those three together. I know you have the cool factor, so I don't know if the NWO loses steam. I mean, you can kind of went into a different direction with those three. And I know Austin is Austin and The Rock is The Rock, but I mean, I think that helps you. But you lose them, and then they break up Hall and Nash, and it's like, ugh, this is terrible. Like, come on, big mistake. Hall and Nash should never feuded. As a fan, like fan perspective, that was like so like, come on, that was so lame.
But it's so endemic of trying to keep angles going for so long. There's always that fatal flaw that they turn the wrong person, or they because you can't keep doing the same thing forever, right? You've got to spin it and move it in a different direction, and usually that's the jumping the shark moment for any of the things. But I mean, a hell of a run. I mean, those NWO checks still come in for those guys, and it's remarkable.
Oh, it's insane. But as we head for the wind down here, we head for the finish. Just give us a big push for the book, where everybody can get it and why everybody should want it.
Well, if you're a fan of professional wrestling, the ECW story is a very important part of that massive compendium of the history of pro wrestling. It changed the business in so many ways, and nobody denies that today. Everybody agrees, whether you liked it or not. Even Cornette will tell you that it changed the business. If he doesn't like it, that bullshit product, yeah, changed it all right, put fucking chairs over people's heads. But you can't deny that it changed the business. And there's really only one individual qualified to tell you the story of ECW from the beginning, and it's Todd Gordon. So Todd is God. It's available everywhere in hardcover, but also audiobook. Let me tell you that story, if you'd like. I narrated it, so it is also available on all the audiobook outlets, and I'm proud of it. I'm glad Todd did it. I'm glad the story's out there. I think it shatters some myths. There's already rumblings from the boys who were surprised to read a few things. But listen, that's what it took. What, 30 years now? Are we 30 years? Yeah, right? 93?
Yeah, almost, yeah.
Yeah, 30 years to have the story come out in its entirety. And it's well deserved.
Thank you for watching the Hannibal TV. Please like this video if you enjoyed it, and click the subscribe button to not miss any of our latest shoot interviews,